Hello. This is the books I've reread the most. And yes, the books I've reread the most, not the novels I've reread the most. Why? Because I haven't reread that many novels. I'm just gonna leave that there. So yeah, this is basically I think Attack now. I think Sean Stamp has started it, but I'm not completely sure because Scott Bradfield also made a similar video a while ago, I think on the same day. So yeah, one of them started it. I'll link their videos in the description. But then I think Steve Donaghy also made a video. He added rules to it and like converted it properly into Attack. Another Bibliophile reads. James Holder and Paul Freeman also made videos about the 10 novels they've read the most. Now these people, they all have something in common. They all have reread more books and read more books in quantity than me, and they also have been reading for longer. I just can't do that tag, but I really wanna have my say, but I cannot do that tag by those rules and by those standards because I am a reading baby. My reading life is just started. I've been probably what is to say like consistently and in quantity and like reading daily or pretty much daily. It's only been for the last 3 years, 4 years, I'd say 4 years, and only for the last 3 years have I been reading at least one book a week. Before that, it would have been radically less, like maybe 10 books a year, right? So for that reason, I'm gonna have to do something that I actually like doing, which is just like breaking rules and adapting things to my own wants and needs, and that is basically modifying this book tag. How am I gonna modify it? Which basically this is gonna be the books I've reread the most. It's not gonna be 4 times like Sunday Stamp has put as a requirement. It's just gonna be reread the most. In some cases, just reread. Because rereading is enough. Because even though there are many books that like I will reread, and books that I immediately finish and want to reread, I've always been painfully aware of how like the tsunami of books to be read that it's waiting. That it's just like overwhelming. So this I don't feel like I'm yet in my rereading phase of my life. However, there is a number of books that I have reread. I am leaving only one type of book outside of the books I've reread and outside of this tag, and that is because that is the type of book I've reread the most, and I could make a whole list by itself, and that's poetry books. I've reread many poetry books, more than 10, and there are poetry books that I've reread more than 10 times. So yeah, I'll make a video apart about the poetry books that I've reread the most in time. But now let's focus on everything else. There is only one novel that I have reread the most, that I have reread, basically the only novel I've reread in my life that I can remember right now. And for that reason, I'm gonna leave it to the end because it's the only one that fits the that fits the tag. So yeah, let's get started. Before getting started, no honorable mention. I read in the Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad like last week or something like that, like a few days ago, in a translation in Spanish. I did not like that translation, so I got this one, and I'm gonna be rereading this one very, very soon. So this is also gonna be probably the second novel I reread in my life. Probably not, because actually as I speak, I'm starting to remember other novels when I was a teenager that I reread that I just haven't included here because I don't have them in. They're just coming up as I speak. For example, I just remembered now Illusions by Richard Bach. That book, like when I read it as a teenager, I reread that book. I reread that book at least once. And also The Little Prince. Those two books I reread. So yeah, let's focus on what I have here, and then we'll go from there. There are a couple of books I don't have in physical copy, but I'll show you a picture of them. Now, books I reread the most. Let's go with Borges first. So, fictions, short stories. Most of the books I have reread in this list, unlike the books that other booktubers have included in their lists, I haven't reread out of enjoyment or just because I haven't reread just because I was loving the book. I have reread them because I felt like there was so much more to get from the pages that I was not getting at, and I wanted to dive a bit deeper into them. This is one of those. I love every story here. I couldn't choose a favorite one. I remember I really liked the one with the obviously the Library of Babel. I've reread the most in this collection just because I reread that one even before reading the collection. I also the one with the Ruins of Fire. How do you translate that? Let me check. Yeah, the circular ruins. That one. When I read this, it was my favorite story at first. In that moment, I also found the Memorioso, the Remember. Obviously, I reread this on the original language, so I'm just translating. The one about the lottery as well, the Babylonia lottery. That one I also really liked. I think the Shape of the Sword was also quite epic to read. Every story here felt worthy of reading, rereading, and of taking more from it. It reminds me a little bit of another collection of short stories that I think I haven't read fully, but that I've reread some of the stories on that collection, and it's Histories of Cronopios and Famas by Julio Cortázar, which is not in this list, but I've also reread some stories from there, and yeah, it's it's very different, but in a sense it's also similar. The reasons why I reread them and the feelings I had of like being reading something that I just hadn't read anything like before. So yeah, that's it for the short stories. Now we have 3 philosophy books. Yeah, 3 philosophy books. Now it's basically the philosophy is the chunk, is the main chunk of rereading books that I've done, because apart from poetry, which is what I've been reading the most in my life, philosophy is not a discipline of reading, it's a discipline of rereading. Like, reading a text in philosophy is worthless. It's like, it's even better to not read a book than to read it once when it comes to philosophy. If you are gonna like study a text and build ideas from it, or criticize it or something, and it's a philosophical text, you have to reread that text, and it's only on the reread that you really get to have something to say about it, because it's with philosophy it's just like that. It's a rereading discipline. Reading doesn't matter at all, and quantity of reading doesn't matter either. Like, I know some literature students that they just like are told to read like, I don't know, but like more than 1 book a day for their degrees, and then you hear them talk about the books they read, and it's like they don't really know anything about those books, because they just like basically what do they call it, like speed read or skim read. Basically they scan the books, get the facts enough to make like a very superficial comment about it, and move forward, right? Because that's how English lit at least works here in the UK. That's what I've seen. And arguing and speaking about books I've read with the students of literature, you realize that by my own sort of like standards, I would not consider a book to be read if I knew so little about it and remember so little about it just when I just closed the book. So in that sense, I'm definitely for the philosophical approach. When it's better to read a book 7 times in 1 week than to read 7 books once. When it comes to philosophy, when it comes to hard books at least, when it comes to books that are packed, I know I don't live by those standards. Otherwise, I would have reread way more than I have. But I do still think that it's way more valuable in many cases, or at least obviously in their case it's just that they read so fast and they're just like focusing on gathering the information they need for the exam or the essay that they need to do, so they don't really like break down and they just don't really follow the story, or at least it doesn't feel like they do. So definitely sometimes it's better to read a book at a pace that you can actually process the information than to read 3 books in that same time. That is true for me at least. So yeah, going to philosophy, I think the first one I reread, the first philosophy book I reread, okay, let's go chronologically. The first philosophy book I reread is also the longest philosophy book I've read, which is the complete dialogues of Plato. This, I don't know, like I am pretty sure I've reread all of them. It's about 20, I think. If it's more, then maybe I haven't read some of them. But I remember having a collection of not of the same. I had like 7 volumes or something because I didn't have a cohesive collection like that. I just got volumes from different collections, and every time I saw one that had an extra dialogue. Some dialogues I've read many times, so other dialogues I've read like only once. But as a whole, I have reread every dialogue from Plato that I've read, and I think I've read all of the dialogues from Plato. So that is an example of. I have enjoyed some of Plato's dialogues. I enjoyed Ion, I enjoyed Crito, I enjoyed the Apology, I think you call it Socrates' Apology, maybe. I'm translating because the Plato's dialogues are written in Spanish first. Phaedrus, Phaedo, the Symposium, of course. Those I reread also for enjoyment. But generally with Plato is like most of the dialogues don't really like reveal anything to me, and I didn't feel like I was missing out so much on the text either. But they are so relevant to the history of philosophy and to the conversation that philosophy has been having throughout history, that I feel like sort of like carving those dialogues on my mind, making sure I remember them, knowing every part, was very important, and it's been very helpful in order to sort of like realize whenever someone is making a Platonic argument within the. Obviously, if you're making a Platonic argument when you're speaking with me, I'm not going to be like, that's a Platonic argument. But on the philosophical context and the academia and everything, pretty much anyone who's making a Platonic argument knows they are making a Platonic argument as opposed to an Aristotelian argument. And you could almost divide all philosophy or philosophical history between Aristotelians and Platonians. And everything really goes down to Plato. Like it is true that you could very much take any text of philosophy and trace it back to Plato's dialogues. And I was aware of that level of relevance because I was lucky enough to have access to a really good teacher. There is a philosophy teacher in Spanish language called Ernesto Castro who like made his classes public. I think he was the first philosophy teacher in the world to make his classes public in YouTube. And I followed all of those classes even before coming to uni. And I did the readings, and I kept, and I basically listened to his advice and reread, and in some of the dialogues I definitely found new stuff. I never found the literary value that some people attribute to them, especially very passionate philosophy students. I don't think Plato's dialogues are incredibly valuable in terms of literary skill. I think that for that you might as well read Sophocles and will obtain way more from that. But I do see the relevance, and I'm happy I read him. I don't think I will reread most of Plato's dialogues ever again. But it was definitely a bit. There's like a moment of inflection in my reading life from having read those dialogues and not having read them. This is my favorite painting from Klimt on a cup. If you know the name, tell me, like write it on the comments, and if you like any other painting from Klimt, tell me, since I don't know, it seemed like a good pretext to talk about Klimt as well. Okay, let's get away. Next book I read the most is definitely the Nicomachean Ethics. This is another case of a book like, this is a guide. This is the beginning of the self-help aspect of philosophy. This is a moral guide. This is a system of thought to structure your behavior and to live a virtuous life, to achieve eudaimonia, which is not really happiness, but more like flourishing, like your own existential flourishing as a being. You will do that by conjugating arete. Arete means virtuous actions, but the word virtue doesn't really mean virtue in the same way that we understand it now. It has a different context, connotation there. The whole idea of like choosing the mean between two extremes, all of that is here. There's a lot of good stuff here, many of which, if you had a good parents or a good upbringing, people that actually taught you how to be, or if you have a mind in that you use often and to basically do introspective analysis of your behavior, then many of the things here are going to be self-evident. I read it because it's incredibly relevant for philosophy. I think it's definitely worth reading by itself. It's not enjoyable to read particularly. Aristotle wasn't a good writer. He was also the beginning of bad writers in philosophy. But it was certainly. For me, it was just like in the moment when I read it, it reaffirmed some things I already thought. It allowed me to disagree with things I was taking for granted or assumed. It just allowed me to confront many arguments that have like been attached to the core of human behavior. We have certain conventions and moral positions and postures, and many of them come from here, and many of them are correct, and he was correct in many aspects. In other ones, I disagree, but as a whole, I think this is a great book, and I think that if it were written on a better way, this would be a good guide for this would be like a good substitute to some of the self-help that we get, because self-help after all is nothing other than bad philosophy. That's Stoic philosophy and Nicomachean Ethics are a better, like a version of they are basically good self-help or good personal development kind of texts and everything. So you're better off reading something like this if you're feeling lost, but I definitely wouldn't read this for enjoyment, only for its incredible, undeniable relevance on the philosophical canon, on the canon of Western books in general. This is very important. And as you read it, you realize that all of these arguments are still being used. People lives by them, or blames themselves for not living by them, or criticizes them. But this book is pretty much out there. So I'm happy to read this book. It's been very useful also on my philosophy student life, because this and the Plato's Dialogues are the kind of books that philosophy students will never read, but have heard so much of that they use constantly to sort of like to favor their own arguments, but it's good when someone hasn't read a book and they talk about it. It's easy to tell, and if you have read that book and it's useful. It's useful in conversations. That's what I'm trying to say. It's useful in arguments, especially in arguments with pretentious philosophy students. So yeah, that's the other book I've read. Now, if you are ever gonna read a book from this author, which I do not recommend you to read a book from this author at all, if you are my age or younger, because it's I understand why so many people hate Nietzsche. He is a magnet for bad ideas. He is a magnet for students that are arrogant and want to justify their shit behaviors and call their arrogance and their narrowness of mind misanthropy, and call that misanthropy justified through arguments that someone else has made, and see themselves as some sort of like ostracized genius or something like that. This author is definitely often used for those ends, and that for that reason I generally avoid speaking about Nietzsche, because I don't think I have met a single philosophy student who was really into Nietzsche, who was really into Nietzsche and into reading Nietzsche in the way that someone who does that for philosophical interest would be. I know this is like too much like rambling. I don't really know. Like, I hope you know what I mean. That's what I'm trying to say. The Narrative of Morals is probably one of the very few texts that Nietzsche wrote that is cohesive, has a beginning and an end, and is truly, truly relevant. It's also not as dangerous as others, but of course, you know, like, people read this text and they will use the dialectic of the master and the slave and call themselves masters and call their kids and call the other kids slaves. And I see that happening in the university, and that's why I don't like talking about this book, because I don't want people reading this book. I don't want guys reading this book and not reading anything else. There's a Chinese saying that is, don't worry about people who doesn't read, but beware of the readers of a single book, or something like that. Basically, the idea is that people who reads only one book is way more dangerous than people who reads multiple books or who doesn't read at all. And this is the kind of book that people who doesn't read anything else would read. So yeah, I think that saying is incredibly correct. I think I could make a video by itself on only that saying and how right that is. But if you are gonna read Nietzsche, unless you are an art student and you want a game changer on your essays, in which case I would recommend The Birth of Tragedy. This is the other book of Nietzsche to read. There's another essay I reread a lot from Nietzsche that is also really good, and I also recommend. I'll talk about it after this. The reason why this, and I'm done after I say this is not for this critique of religion, it's not for the idea of will to power, it's not for its it's incredibly Darwinist, it's influenced by Darwin a lot. It's not by it's definitely not the dialectic of the master and the slave, and not its sort of like historical context of, like, as I said, sort of like that moment when sort of like gods are dying and science is flourishing, and that triggers many changes on social behavior. But it's the idea of tracing the birth of morality in guilt. Genealogies don't need to be historically accurate to be conceptually right and correct. That's what makes them so interesting. You can, and he was not a great historian, but his arguments and the way he utilizes facts and otherwise, is incredible. And by the end of this book, you at least become aware of how important guilt is as a trigger of morality, where it might have started, what kind of practices continue the spread of that guilt, and what are the consequences of that. So yeah, guilt as the birth of Western morality. That is the worth of this book. Yeah, I feel like I've talked way too much about that. The other essay I reread a lot from Nietzsche that I also recommend is Truth and Lying in a Non-Moral Sense. On Truth and Lying in a more non-moral sense. Great essay about how language is not really, doesn't really have a will to truth. It's not really about saying the truth, about speaking about the reality that we have there. It's about communicating, and communicating means tending breaches, and it's about poetry. There's a moment in that essay where he says that language is an army of metaphors. Saying that has a lot of implications, at least on the way we see our world. When we say the word live, for example, and this is on his essay, there are 1,000 different forms and different shapes that, if looked at in detail, have more things that separate them, that makes them different, than things in common. Yet with the word live, we ignore all of those differences in order to refer to a group of things that don't really have that much in common, as if they did, only because the way we cognize them, the way we sort of like perceive them, makes us associate them. So it's a metaphor. It's not. It doesn't really get at reality, at the individual reality of each leaf. When you say the word leaf, you get further away. You get further away from the leaf itself, from each leaf. And that with everything in language. I think whether or not you agree with it is a very interesting argument. It's a very short essay, and I totally recommend that essay. Now, I think it's one more philosophy book. This one is actually an introduction, but it was so good, and I was thinking, like, I'm not gonna talk much about it. I'm just gonna mention it. But if you are into phenomenology, or you would like to know more about Heidegger, Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, but don't want to read like the chunks, the often unreadable chunkers of that have been written on the phenomenological tradition, definitely read Dan Zahavi, Phenomenology and Introduction, the Basics. Dan Zahavi is a phenomenologist, and he manages to link all of the different phenomenologist ideas into a cohesive introduction, keep their strengths and strengthen their weaknesses together. And I just think it's a great book. I reread it. It was incredibly helpful. I think it is mainly responsible for my understanding of phenomenology. And I was reading Heidegger. I reread passages from Heidegger's Being and Time. I reread passages from chapters from Husserl's on the crisis of the human sciences and transcendental phenomenology, but I haven't read any of those books cover to cover, nor do I want to. That's Javi. Phenomenology, the Basics. If you want to know more about the idea of phenomenology, if you're not familiar with it, I just can't now start speaking about phenomenology. But I'll eventually will have to go back to it if I keep studying philosophy, and we'll make an introduction or something. Otherwise, literally just search an introduction. There's like plenty in YouTube. I'm not gonna be the sort of like philosophy booktuber that gives you that kind of information, because it requires an amount, like, to be able to speak here accurately without being completely destroyed by 15 philosophy students that have read that just read yesterday the book you're talking about. It requires a lot of time. I will have to reread everything and then be here like, hey, this is phenomenology, this is not phenomenology. These were the arguments, and this is the epoch. This is the idea of like isolating an object and seeing. I don't wanna get into that. Yeah, I'm gonna move on. I don't really want to talk phenomenology, but I do think that you might have heard about it. It's one of the most important branches. It's flourishing now even more of philosophy. There's thousands of videos on YouTube that will give you more information than I can give you now in 30 seconds, and yeah, that's all I want to say. Minima Moralia. I haven't read this book cover to cover. Never. I have never read this book cover to cover, but I have reread every passage in this book. This is just aphorisms. It doesn't require like any linear reading or anything. This was written during Adorno's Theodore Adorno exilium. He was basically in exile because of what was going on in Germany in the last century. I made a video about this book, and I think that video probably will tell you much more than I can tell you now because it's not a recent read, and it's not a recent reread. But I have it next to my bed, and every now and then I read an aphorism, and it's very incisive, very needling, just like merciless critiques of human behavior, of our societies, of capitalism, of the places we live in, and the structures we build around ourselves, and how we let the dynamics and the wheels to keep turning. It's just not only incredibly right to many degrees, but also scary in a very hopeless way. That the things this book was critiquing are not only still happening now, but are worse now, have only worsened since this book was written more than 50 years ago. So yeah, it's Minima Moralia, Reflections from Madame H's Life. I recommend this book. I recommend reading through it, and it's not for Adorno. This book is not hard to understand. The aphorisms, you can take them and read 3 times, and you will get a lot of it. Yeah, I this for a moment when I finished this book, I thought it was my favorite book. I don't know. I would have to go back to it now. But I think definitely in these pages there is something. There is gonna be one aphorism that is gonna just get to you, and to your own particular experience with the world and your own particular struggles. In a very touching manner. It's not a hopeful book. It's not. It's also not as neutral as other philosophical texts. This book is not meant to be. This book is not meant to be studied but suffered through and criticized them. Like, he wrote it a little bit as a polemic, just putting out his ideas without having to do the work of justifying self-evident truths. Which means that there is a lot to disagree with in that book as well, okay? But most of the things that like the things that have the greatest weight on that book, that gives it its value, and also its also that also make painful to read are pretty much true and palpable, tangible realities. So yeah, I'm gonna stop talking because these books it's just so hard to talk about them in a list that I get paralyzed. So let's get to the last book and finish on a more positive note. And this is the only novel I have reread that I can remember, apart from the ones I mentioned at the beginning of the book, of the video. And this is also the only book I mentioned, the only book on this list that I reread only for pure enjoyment. This was a beautiful, great reading experience. It showed me, this book probably showed me, or reminded me more, because I was halfway through my philosophy degree, undergraduate course, and I had been reading only non-fiction, very dry non-fiction, what you guys call non-fiction, and it's just philosophy, for a while. And then I read this book and was like, wow, I'm going to sleep thinking about this book, waking up thinking about this book, just wanting to read it and read it and read it. And that is a book that I will also read again soon, and I will read also the whole saga, which I haven't read yet. Dune by Frank Herbert. I don't have it on me, and that's better for you because I have a beautiful vintage cover. Not this one. The one I have is actually a spoiler. Like in the cover, you have a spoiler of the book, which I found funny because I only realized it once I already had read it. But also, what the fuck, Who puts a spoiler on the cover? Yeah, so those are the books I've reread the most, and this is my own reread book stack. I'll do another one about poetry. Sorry for the rambling in the long silences. When we got to philosophy, I just felt like struck by a train between Nietzsche and Adorno and all these people, phenomenology, it's all the shadows of my past lives. But I enjoy doing this a lot, and I'll link the videos of the better readers, the more proficient readers, on the description. And have a good day.